Hi everyone, my name is Johnny Lee. Today's presentation is titled Constructing Out-of-Money Longevity Hedges Using Parametric Mortality Indices. The production of this podcast is supported by the 2017 Society of Actuaries Centers of Actuarial Excellence grant. So, I wanted to give you a brief idea as to what you may expect from this video. In this video, I will spend quite a bit of time on the background materials. First of all, I will introduce the concept of parametric mortality indices. Then I will drill deeper into a specific type of mortality indices, which is known as the CBD Mortality Index. And then I will move to the objectives of today's research. All right, and then I will explain some securities that may be written on the CBD mortality indices. These include K-forwards, K-calls, and K-puts. And I will also explain how they may be applied for risk management purposes. All right, given these security structures, I will explain how we may price these securities. And we will go through the risk-neutral cost breakdown model, and we'll also develop some pricing formulas and also longevity grids, which can be used for deriving hedging strategies. Finally, I will spend some time on hedging and draw some insights from the hedging results. Okay, so parametric mortality indices. So what are mortality indices? Well, just like stock indices such as TSX, S&P 500, mortality indices are indices that summarize levels of mortality at different time points. They can be used to quantify mortality and longevity risk. And more importantly, with these indices, we can create standardized mortality-linked securities through which mortality or longevity risk can be transferred from one party to another. Compared to non-index-based longevity risk transfers, index-based transfers are advantageous of being more transparent, and because of this, they may be potentially cheaper and more conducive to the development of liquidity. And on top of that, because they are standardized, they allow us to eliminate the possibility of information asymmetry, and that will in turn open up an additional pool of buyers, for example, hedge funds. Well, the concept of mortality indices is not new. There are existing mortality indices, and here are a few examples. So we have previously Credit Suisse Longevity Index, QXX, the QXX index produced by Goldman Sachs, the Life Metrics Index that was introduced by JP Morgan and Life and Longevity Markets Association, and the expat cohort indices introduced by Deutsche Börse. All right, so I would describe all of these indices as non-parametric. We call them non-parametric indices because in the calculation of these indices, there is no model, i.e. no parameter involved. For example, to calculate the Credit Suisse index, we can easily use crude central mortality rates, and likewise, the calculation of the number of survivors in the QXX index requires no model or parameters. Now, well, VA Model 3 may be seen as a good thing, but then, without the aid of a model, the information that can be created by such an index is quite limited. So what are the consequences? The main consequence is that to build an effective longevity hedge using non-parametric indices, a large number of indices, i.e. securities, will need to be used. Because of this, we may want to consider parametric, i.e. model-based mortality indices instead. Now, these indices parametric mortality indices are developed from primarily the time-varying parameters in a chosen stochastic mortality model. And as I will demonstrate later, these indices can be richer in information content. Let me drill deeper into one specific type of mortality indices, which is known as the CBD mortality indices, and then I will explain how these indices may convey more information than traditional non-parametric indices. Okay, as you can tell from its name, the CBD mortality index is developed from the Connes-Blackdown, i.e. the CBD model. And for those who are not very familiar with this model, let me recap the features of this model in just one slide. All right, this model captures the logic transformed probability of death at hx and year t with the combination of parameters on the right-hand side. So we have the first parameter, kappa 1, which is time varying, and the second parameter, kappa 2, which is also time varying. All right, we say that kappa 1 and kappa 2 are the first and second CBD mortality indices, respectively. Okay, so how do we interpret these indices? Well, let me go back to the equation and then explain further. So the first CBD index, highlighted in blue, represents at a given time point the level of the mortality curve after a logit transformation. So what this means is that a reduction in kappa 1t represents an overall mortality improvement, an improvement that is applied to all ages under consideration. The second CBD index, which is highlighted in green, on the other hand, represents the gradient of the logit transformed mortality curve. And because of this, an increase in the second index means that mortality at younger ages improves more rapidly than at older ages. Well, I think the intuitions behind the first and second CBD indices can be seen more readily from this diagram. Now, on this Cartesian coordinate plane, the horizontal axis represents the first CBD mortality index, and the vertical axis represents the second CBD mortality index. The dotted lines represent their respective expected values. Okay, so let's focus on the variation of the first index along the horizontal dimension. Okay, so if the first CBD index is lower than expected, that means overall improvement is fast. That means overall mortality improvement is faster than expected. And the opposite is true if the index turns out to be higher than expected. And we call the variation along the horizontal dimension as K1 risk. Likewise, along the vertical dimension, a higher than expected value of the second index represents more improvement at younger ages, and the opposite is true if the index turns out to be lower than expected. And we call the variation of the index along the vertical dimension as K2 risk. Okay, so let us think about what may happen to a pension plan. All right, for a pension plan that is close to new entrants, the payouts will be larger if, number one, overall mortality improvement is faster than expected, i.e. the first CBD index is lower than expected. Secondly, all the things equal, there is more improvement at older ages compared to younger ages, i.e. the second CBD index is lower than expected. So these pension plans are subject to a double hit, the worst scenario, when the first and second CBD mortality indices are lower than expected. Okay, so we've gone through the intuitions. I wanted to come back to the point that the CBD indices may contain more information compared to non-parametric mortality indices. Now, on this diagram, I have shown different curves of death probabilities using different combinations of the first and second CBD mortality indices. And as we can see, with just two parameters, we are able to generate mortality curves with very different shapes. So with just two indices, I can mimic different non-parallel shapes in the underlying mortality curve. So in that sense, the CBD mortality indices may be considered as richer in information contents than existing non-parametric indices. Some work has already been done on parametric mortality indices. For example, a security known as K-forwards has previously been proposed. Some hedging strategies have been developed. The counterparty credit risk associated with securities linked to the CBD mortality indices have also been studied. So, what's new in today's presentation? In today's presentation, I'm going to do three things. Number one, I'm going to explore security structures other than a zero coupon swap and examine how the alternative security structures which will feature option-like payoffs may benefit the hedger. Number two, I'm going to study risk-neutral valuation of K-forwards and other securities, including K-calls and K-puts, written on parametric mortality indices. And finally, number three, I'm going to develop some static and dynamic hedging strategies based on K-forwards and K-options. Okay, so let's talk about the securities now. I'm going to go through three simple types of securities in today's presentation. The first one is the existing K-forward, which is very simple. So, for a K-forward written to a CBD mortality index, the payoff is simply K minus the value of the CBD mortality index at maturity. So I have the payoff structure specified in this formula. And K-call, which features an option-like payoff. So for a European K-call on a CBD mortality index, the payoff at maturity is the maximum of these two numbers, the CBD index minus the strike value K and 0. And likewise, I can define the payoff for a K-put as the maximum of the difference between the strike value and the CBD index and 0. Pretty straightforward. Okay, now the securities are there. How can we use these securities to create risk management solutions? Well, let us use an example to explain. We consider pension plans, closed pension plans. And as I previously mentioned, for a closed pension plan, its liability is higher in two scenarios. Number one, overall mortality improvement is faster than expected, and this corresponds to the situation when future values of the first CBD index are lower than expected. Secondly, its liability is higher when mortality improvement is more concentrated at older ages than at younger ages, and this corresponds to the situation when future values of the second CBD mortality index are lower than expected. So, we can see that closed pension plans are subject to downside K1 and K2 risk, and along this line, to hedge the longevity risk exposures of a closed pension plan, we may, either write K1 and K2 forwards as a fixed rate receiver so that if the CBD indices turn out to be lower than expected, as a hedger, we receive payoffs from the counterparty to offset the correspondingly larger liability. Or we may want to take a short position of K1 and K2 calls, or we can take a long position of K1 and K2 puts. With similar arguments, we can see that we can also develop hedging strategies for a life insurer using K forwards, K puts, and K calls. Now, given the arguments are very similar, I'm not going to go through them in detail. So the securities are there. My next step is to price these securities, and to this end, I'm going to consider the risk-neutral Cons breakdown model. So let me go back to the Cons breakdown model from which the CBD mortality indices are developed. So to recap, the CBD model captures the logic transformed value of death probability at hx and time t as a combination of two parameters, kappa 1t and kappa 2t. Now, under the real-world probability measure, it is assumed that the vector of the two CBD indices, kappa 1t and kappa 2t, follows a random walk with drift, like this. All right, and then we assume that under the risk-neutral or risk-adjusted probability measure, the vector of CBD indices follows a random walk with a perturbed intervention, or equivalently speaking, the vector of CBD indices in the risk-neutral measure is assumed to follow a random walk with a drift factor that is different from the real-world counterpart. What's next? We have to calibrate the risk-neutral process. In other words, we have to find the unknown vector lambda. And to do this, we have to calibrate the model to market information, i.e. market prices of mortality-linked products, for example, individual life annuities. Now, in our baseline calculations, we set lambda 1 and lambda 2 to 0.175. These values are taken from a previous paper of Andrew Cons and his co-authors, who calibrated these unknown lambda values using the market price of the longevity bond that was jointly announced by BNP Paribas and the European Investment Bank in 2004. So we have the risk-neutral process, and then there is a little bit of math here. So what I'm going to do next is to derive, on the basis of the risk-neutral process for kappa 1t and kappa 2t, the expected value and the variance under the risk-neutral measure of each of the two CBD mortality indices, and after a little bit of mathematical derivation, we arrive at these two formulas. All right, with these two formulas, we are ready to derive pricing formulas for each of the securities that we have introduced. So, for K forwards, the pricing formula is rather straightforward. We just take expected value under the risk-neutral probability measure of the payoff from a K forward discounted at the risk-free interest rate, and it turns out that it is just a linear function of the risk-neutral expected value of the CBD mortality index at maturity. And with this pricing formula, I can proceed to derive longevity grids for a K forward. So I have the delta and the gamma, which are defined as the first and second derivatives of the values of the K forward with respect to the CBD mortality index, respectively. Okay, K calls, the formula is a little bit more involved, but we can see that it depends entirely and only on the risk-neutral expected value and variance of the associated CBD mortality index and maturity only. I can derive deltas and gammas for K calls, and then I can do something very similar for K pairs. So I have the pricing formula, delta, and gamma. Okay, so with all these, I can develop some hedging strategies for pension plans. So let me begin with the setup. For simplicity, I'm assuming that at any time, the longevity hedge contains two hedging instruments, one written on each of the two CBD mortality indices. I'm further assuming that all hedges are established at time t0. And for simplicity, I'm only considering delta hedging. So with delta hedging, the notional amount of the ith instrument is calculated by this hedge ratio, which is indeed the ratio of the delta of the liability being hedged and the delta of the hedging instruments. And I consider two types of hedges, including cash flow hedges, which focus on the variability of the cash flows arising from the liability being hedged and the hedging instruments, and value hedges, which focus on the variability of the values of the hedged position at a certain future time point, say 10 years from time t0. Okay, so some assumptions concerning the liability being hedged. I'm assuming that the liability being hedged is a whole life annuity. Each payment is $1, payable at the end of each year for as long as the individual is alive. And I'm assuming that the individuals are age x0 at time 0 when the hedge is established. Okay, so the time t value of the liability can be expressed as the sum of the expected cash flows under the risk-neutral probability measure discounted to time t0 using the risk-free interest rate. Now, there is no analytical formula for calculating the liability value. We will use an approximation technique to avoid any nested simulation. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the details of the approximation methods. One thing that I would like to look at specifically in my empirical results is the relationship between hedge effectiveness and moneyness of the hedging instrument. In the context of the CBD mortality indices, moneyness is defined by this formula: the difference between the strike value and the risk-neutral expectation of the CBD mortality index divided by the standard deviation of the variance of the CBD mortality index under the risk-neutral probability measure. So, if K, the strike value, equals precisely the risk-neutral expectation of the CBD mortality index at maturity, then we say that the K options are at the money. If the strike value is less than the risk-neutral expected value of the CBD mortality index at maturity, then we say that the K call is in the money while the K put is out of the money. And finally, if the opposite is true, we say that the K put is in the money and the K call is out of the money. And these terminologies are very similar to those used in stock options. Okay, so some further assumptions. I'm assuming that the individuals are all aged 65 at the beginning of the hedge. I'm assuming that the hedge portfolio is composed of either 1K forward on each of the two CBD mortality indices, or 1K put on each of the two CBD mortality indices. I have a maturity date of 15 years from time t0, the assumed market prices of risk, and a 2% risk-free interest rate. And finally, I'm assuming that both the CBD mortality indices and the annuity liability are linked to the mortality experience of English and Welsh male population. I'm not going to go through every single numbers in the empirical results, but I would like to highlight the interesting findings that we have obtained. So, interesting findings. Number one, for cash flow hedges, a K-put hedge tends to yield a lower value at risk compared to the corresponding K-forward hedge when the market prices of risk are high. Okay, so what is the intuition behind? Now, think about this. For a K-put, as a hedger, you are only paying risk premium for your downside risk. But then for a K-forward, you are paying risk premium for both upside and downside risk. So in this sense, a K-put, in principle, should be a cheaper hedging instrument. And the cost advantage of K-puts are obviously higher when the market prices of longevity risk are high, and our results reflect this important relationship. But then, if the market prices of risk are too high, then both K-put and K-forward hedges may no longer be economically justifiable. That said, there is a threshold market price of risk beyond which hedging makes no sense. Thirdly, we find that for static cash flow hedges, a K-put hedge tends to result in a smaller value at risk compared to the corresponding K-forward hedge when the times to maturity of the hedging instruments are long. Well, again, that is related to the cost advantage of K-puts over K-forwards. When the time to maturity is long, the cost advantage of a K-put over a K-forward becomes more apparent. Finally, we find that value hedges are very effective even when the market prices of risk are high, and that may be attributed to the fact that for value hedges, we have a definite, rather short horizon, and it is a lot easier to obtain a high hedge effectiveness compared to a cash flow hedge which considers all cash flows over the entire lifetime of the liability. So finally, just to sum up what we have done in this presentation. So firstly, we have introduced some new security structures. We have introduced K-puts and K-options written on the CBD mortality indices, and we have explained how K-options may be utilized by hedgers. Secondly, we have derived exact analytical pricing formulas for K-forwards and options, which can be readily used in practice. Thirdly, we have introduced different types of longevity hedges. We have derived analytical expressions for longevity grids for K-forwards and options, and these grids are essential for developing longevity hedging strategies. We have further examined the relative performance between K-options and K-forwards in different circumstances, in particular in different levels of moneyness. Okay, so that is the end of this presentation. Thank you for watching.